Nearly 250 years before Jesus was born, a group of Jewish scholars broke their own grammar rules on purpose. They did it to protect a single word in a single sentence, sitting on the third page of the Bible. It wasn't a mistake. These were careful men, translating the Hebrew scriptures into Greek, and in this one verse, they wrote something the rules of their own language said was wrong. The era tells us exactly what they believed that sentence meant. They believed it was about a person, one person, not yet arrived. To understand why, we have to go back. Not to the middle of the Bible, where most people expect the first promise of a rescuer to appear. We have to go back to page 3, to the worst moment in the whole story. Open almost any Bible. Genesis chapter 1. Light, sky, sea, animals, people. Chapter 2. A garden, a command, a warning. And then chapter 3. Everything breaks. You know the outline of what happens. A question from a serpent, a choice, a piece of fruit, and then the slow, sinking realization that something has gone wrong that cannot be taken back. The man hides, the woman hides, and God begins to speak, not in comfort, but in consequence. He speaks to the serpent, he speaks to the woman, he speaks to the man. 3 statements, and each one carries a weight: pain, struggle, dust, death. This is a courtroom, and the verdict is falling. But buried inside the words spoken to the serpent, before the woman is addressed, before the man hears his sentence, there is one line that does not belong with the others. It is not a punishment. It is a promise. Here it is, in the older English of the King James: "And I will put enmity between thee and the woman, and between thy seed and her seed. It shall bruise thy head, and thou shalt bruise his heel." Read quickly. It sounds like a curse on a snake. Read slowly. It is the first time in the Bible that anyone is promised a way out. The earliest Christian writers had a name for it. By the 2nd century, men like Justin Martyr and Irenaeus were already calling this verse the protoevangelium, Latin and Greek stitched together to mean the first gospel, the first good news. And it shows up on page 3, which raises a strange question, one most sermons skip right past. If this is the first promise of rescue for human beings, why is God not saying it to the human beings? He is not turning to the woman. He is not turning to the man. He is speaking to the enemy. Sit with how odd that is. Picture the scene the way the text frames it. 3 figures stand condemned, and God moves down the line. To the woman, words about pain. To the man, words about thorns, sweat, and a return to dust. These are the consequences, and they are heavy. But the serpent is addressed first, and it is in that address, the one aimed at the guilty party, that the single ray of light appears. The hope for the victims is tucked inside the sentence against the attacker. It is as if a judge, while pronouncing sentence on a criminal, leaned over and quietly told him, "And one day, someone is coming who will undo everything you've done." The promise is real, but it reaches the man and woman sideways. They overhear their own rescue. And there is one more detail that the careful reader notices and never forgets. God does not promise the seed of the man. In the ancient world, lineage and descent were almost always traced through the father. The seed of Abraham, the seed of David. That was the language. But here, against the grain of the entire culture, the promise speaks of the seed of the woman. It is an unusual phrase, close to unprecedented. Most likely it simply points back to Eve, the one the serpent deceived. The conflict returns to where it began, but the strangeness of it lingers, and centuries later, readers would look back at that single word, her, and feel it pointing somewhere they did not yet understand. To find out why all of this fits together, we have to look at the words themselves, starting with the one word those Jewish scholars fought to protect. The word is zera. In English, your Bible probably translates it seed, or in newer versions, offspring. It looks simple. It is not. Zera starts with farming. It is the seed a farmer scatters into the ground, the small, dry thing that disappears into the dirt and comes back as harvest. From there, the meaning grows outward, the way meanings do. Seed becomes the thing that produces life. So zera comes to mean a man's offspring, then a single child, then, stretched wider, an entire line of descendants, a family, a people, a nation across centuries. Here is the problem hiding in plain sight. Zera can mean one child, or it can mean 1,000 descendants. And the word itself does not tell you which. It is like the English word seed. If I say the seed of Abraham, do I mean one person or millions? The word alone won't decide it for you. This is exactly where modern translations make a quiet choice that most readers never notice. When they translate Genesis 3:15 as her offspring or her descendants, and then use the words they and them, they are leaning toward the plural. They are reading it as humanity in general, locked in a long struggle with evil in general. And that is a possible reading. It really is. But notice what it does. It takes a word that was deliberately left open, one child or many, and it closes the door on one. It buries the individual under the crowd. So now we are stuck with the same ambiguity the ancient reader faced. One descendant or all of them? A single rescuer or just the endless human fight against the dark? If the word zera can't settle it, then how could anyone, ancient or modern, claim to know which one the author meant? It turns out the answer was never in that word at all. It was hiding in the very next one. Look again at the second half of the verse. He shall bruise thy head, and thou shalt bruise his heel. That little word, he, is the Hebrew hu. And in Hebrew grammar, it is not decoration. It is a signal. Here is the rule, and it is the quiet center of this whole investigation. When the word zera, seed, is followed by a singular subject pronoun like hu, it almost always points to one specific individual, not a crowd, not a nation, a person. Scholars who have gone through every case in the Hebrew Bible find the same pattern again and again. When the writer means a people, the grammar shifts toward the plural. When the writer means one descendant, you get exactly this: singular seed, singular pronoun. Think about what that means. The author of Genesis had a choice. He could have written it in a way that clearly meant your descendants, plural, the human race against the snake. He didn't. He used the singular. He pointed, grammatically, at one. Now, I want to be honest with you, because this is where careful readers and serious scholars disagree, and you deserve to hear both sides. Some argue that zera here is collective, that it still means humanity as a whole, and the singular he simply agrees with the grammatical form of the word, not with a real single person. That is a genuine position, held by real scholars, and it is not foolish. We will come back to it, because there is a piece of evidence that speaks directly to it. But on the level of the grammar alone, the writer reached for the form that, everywhere else, marks an individual. He had other options. He chose this one. So the Hebrew leans toward a single person. But that is one language, one tradition. Here is the question that turns this from an interpretation into an investigation. Did anyone else, independently, in another language, long ago, read this verse and come to the same conclusion? Because if they did, this stops being a Christian idea read backward into an old text. It becomes something much harder to explain away. They did, and we have their work. Around the middle of the 3rd century before Christ, nearly 250 years before Jesus would be born, in Alexandria, Jewish scholars began translating their scriptures out of Hebrew and into Greek. The result is called the Septuagint. It mattered enormously. It became the Bible that Greek-speaking Jews read, and the version the New Testament writers themselves often quoted. These were not amateurs. They were translating their own sacred text, and they cared deeply about getting it right. When they reached Genesis 3:15, they hit a grammar problem, and what they did with it left a fingerprint. In Greek, the word for seed is sperma, and sperma is neuter. Grammatically, it has no gender. The iron rule of Greek is that a pronoun must match its noun. So when the translators needed a word for he shall bruise your head, the grammatically correct choice was auto, the neuter, it. That is what the rules demand. That is what they used everywhere else. If that sounds abstract, think of it this way. Some languages assign every noun a gender. A table is she, a book is he, a window is it, whether or not the object is actually male or female. The word seed in Greek is one of those neutral it words. So if you are following the rules, anything you say about the seed afterward has to stay neutral too. You say the seed it, not the seed he. To switch to he is to override the grammar. It is to stop describing a thing and start describing a person. It is the difference between the committee it decided and the committee he decided. The second one only makes sense if, in your mind, you have stopped seeing a group and started seeing a single man. Here, and, as far as the careful studies can find, only here when rendering this kind of pronoun in Genesis, they did not use auto, they wrote autos, the masculine, he. Stop and feel the weight of that. They broke their own grammar. A neuter noun, seed, followed not by the neuter it that the rules required, but by the masculine he. This is not a slip of the pen from someone who didn't know better. These were experts in both languages. The cleanest explanation scholars offer is the simple one. They wrote he because they were thinking of a he, a person, a coming individual. Now remember the honest objection from a moment ago, the scholars who say zera is just collective, just humanity in general. Here is why the Septuagint matters so much to that debate. These translators were Jewish, working nearly 2.5 centuries before Jesus of Nazareth was born. They had no Christian theology to defend, no cross to read backward into the text, and faced with a verse they could have rendered safely, in perfect grammar, as it, they chose, against the rules, to write he. That is the thing that is so hard to wave away. The earliest evidence that this verse points to a single person does not come from the church. It comes from the synagogue. It was set down by Jewish hands, in Greek, long before the first Christmas. They wrote he on purpose. The only question left is, who were they expecting? To answer that, we have to follow the word seed out of page 3 and watch where it goes. Once you know to watch for it, seed becomes a thread you can follow through the entire Bible, and it is almost never random. It starts immediately. In the very next chapter, Genesis 4, the conflict the promise described stops being abstract and becomes a family tragedy. Two brothers, Cain and Abel, one ends up killing the other. The very first generation born outside the garden already splits into two lines, two kinds of people, exactly as the verse warned, enmity, set loose in the world. And when Eve gives birth again, after the loss of Abel, she names the child and speaks of him as the seed God appointed to replace the son she lost. The word is already moving, already carrying the weight of a replacement, a continuation, a hope that the line will not die. Page 3 planted it. Chapter 4 shows it taking root. Then it widens, and the pattern becomes unmistakable. God comes to Abraham and promises that in his seed, all the families of the earth will be blessed. The rescue is no longer a vague figure in a garden. It now runs through a specific family. It narrows again to the line of David, where God promises a seed who will sit on a throne that never ends. Watch what is happening across these centuries. The same word, seed, keeps surfacing at every hinge of the story, and each time it carries the same freight. A coming one, a descendant, someone who will finally set things right. For generations, the thread runs underground through the Old Testament, half buried, easy to miss if you are not watching for it. And then, in the New Testament, someone picks up the thread and says out loud what the grammar had been hinting all along. The Apostle Paul, writing to the Galatians, looks back at the promises made to Abraham's seed, and he stops on the word. The promise, he argues, was not made to seeds, as if to many. It was made to one, and he names that one as the Messiah. Notice how precise that is. Paul is not inventing a reading. He is doing exactly what the Hebrew grammar pointed toward and what the Greek translators marked centuries before him. He is reading the singular as a single person. Three witnesses, the Hebrew author, the Septuagint scholars, and Paul, all landing on one. The thread even loops back to the snake. Late in the New Testament, Paul tells the Romans, in words that echo straight out of page 3, that the God of peace will crush Satan under their feet. The bruised head from Genesis 3 is still there, still being pressed down, thousands of years later. And the very last book of the Bible returns to the image one more time. A woman, a serpent, and her offspring locked in conflict, exactly as it was first announced in the garden. So the whole library bends back toward one sentence. 66 books, more than 1,000 years of writing, dozens of authors who never met, and the thread they are all holding was tied off on page 3. Which brings us, finally, to the part of the verse we have been circling the whole time. Because the promise does not just name a person. It tells you, in one repeated word, how he wins. Read the two halves of the promise side by side. He shall bruise thy head, and thou shalt bruise his heel. In English, it looks like two different events. In Hebrew, it is the same word, twice. The verb is shuf, to strike, to bruise, to crush. The serpent does it, the seed does it. The identical action, aimed in two directions. That repetition is not clumsy writing. It is the whole point. Both sides land a blow. Both sides are wounded. This is not a clean victory where the hero walks away untouched. The seed and the serpent strike each other with the same force. What decides the outcome is not the blow. It is the location. A strike to the heel is real. It hurts. It can even be deadly if the serpent is venomous. But a heel heals, or at least a heel is survivable. A strike to the head is something else. Crush the head and the fight is over. Same verb, same wound in a sense. But one is a wound you can rise from, and the other is the end. And think about the geometry of it, because the picture is almost unbearably precise. A serpent lies low to the ground. The only part of a standing man it can reach is the heel, the lowest point, the place where the foot meets the dust. The man was just told he would return to. And the only way a man can kill a serpent that has struck him is to bring his foot down on its head. The two blows are not just symbolic. They are the literal mechanics of a man and a snake locked together. The man is bitten in the act of crushing. He does not win from a safe distance. He wins by stepping into the strike, taking the wound in the very motion that ends his enemy. Victory and injury happen in the same instant. You cannot separate them. And now every layer we have peeled snaps together. The strange position on page 3, the open word zera, the singular pronoun hu that points to one, the Jewish scholars who broke their grammar to keep him a he, the thread of seed running all the way to a cross and a crushed serpent. They were never separate clues. They were one promise, set down in the darkest hour of the story, hidden inside a sentence spoken to the enemy. A single descendant of the woman would take a real wound to the heel and in the same motion end the one who struck him. That is why those translators refuse to write it. You don't break the rules of your own language for an abstraction. You break them for a person you are still waiting for. We tend to imagine that hope in the Bible arrives late, earned slowly, after generations of waiting, somewhere deep in the prophets. But that is not where it is. The first promise of rescue is not in the middle of the book. It is on the third page. It arrives in the same breath as the first disaster, before the man and woman have even left the garden, while the verdict is still being spoken. And it does not arrive as a soft word of comfort. It arrives as a declaration of war, spoken over the head of the enemy, naming a conflict that the rest of Scripture will spend 1,000 years unfolding. The oldest readers saw it. The Greek translators marked it against their own rules. The thread runs from that one sentence all the way to the end of the book. The first gospel was never an afterthought. It was the first thing said when everything fell apart. If watching this changed how you see the opening pages, that the whole story was set in motion by one sentence most people read straight past, then follow along, because this is one promise in a chain of them. We are going to keep pulling the thread, because the next promise isn't hidden in a grammar rule. It's hidden inside a name God changed on purpose, that quietly tells you what was coming. That's where we go next.